So the flow of oceans of information. I want to take a moment to discuss the way we interface with the internet and how it could be affecting what we perceive as something worth saying. Let me stop you there before we get too lost in the misinformation weeds line of thought that creates a situation where the members of the group give up individuality for the sake of perceived greater good, i.e. respect for the members' feelings or emotions, emotional trauma. I like to think about the evolution of communication among humans like a stream or a river. Initially, when our species was trying to point at things and make motions at their intentions, I see this as a small creek or crick, depending on how podunk you'd like to get. It is just a small movement of water with little to no momentum, except in those moments when it rains and the tide rises and starts to shape the land around it. Next comes scratching things into cave walls for more permanent thoughts, even if the idea is incomprehensible by anyone except its creator. This stage is when the small babbling brook becomes a larger, more established movement of water. It doesn't dry up anymore, but the tide only lowers, also causing many more changes to the environment, like moving large amounts of dirt and maybe eroding its way to bedrock or stone. There isn't much coherent thought happening, but enough of it is happening to begin to make permanent changes to the environment, thus solidifying some part of the communication in our daily life. Finally, we come to the fun part. When that little river you used to hang out at when you were a wee little babe or lass has become a body of water that you find it difficult to skip a rock to the other side anymore, not just a small fickle movement. This is when we develop the language, and only a tad, written language. The flow of ideas is now much greater, thus many more chances for bad ideas, lest we forget this should allow for an equal amount of good ideas if we let this function run its course. At this stage of the river, we can easily flow with the river, yet still, if one chooses, could also divert from the flow or even reverse course if not for an additional expenditure of energy. The large river could sustain multiple smaller rivers off of it that could begin to create their own mark on the planet, one dissimilar to the original but still done with the same tools or traits. So many different languages were created that spoke to those who listened and furthered the splintering of ideas, though not bad or worse, just different. Now, we're beginning to have a little fun with this, right? All of our recorded history is the product of this point in the river analogy. Extra, extra! The printing press is invented. This is when that river is not just a body, but a thick one at that. Yuck, yuck. Think the Amazon, Nile, or Mississippi rivers. At this point, the river is so big that not only does it contain many other branching rivers, but it has made much more progress on erosion, digging deeper into the land and making massive changes to the environment, shaping it with only the will of the water. Thoughts were now distributed en masse so that the mainstream, sorry, didn't mean to do that, but this analogy is getting kind of funny towards the end here, so bear with me, now has much more momentum behind it. This makes those initial divergences difficult because there is so much more mass behind the main source. It ultimately starts to dry the small creeks and rivers branching from the mainstream. In this analogy, this is when we continue to have individual thoughts, but what didn't go with the flow was largely stomped out or dried out and consequently written out of our recorded history. The final evolution in my eyes and at my current point of understanding, and this shitty analogy, obviously, is the internet and its predecessors like radio and TV. What, you thought I was going to start this bitch off with a pretentious line like, so I want to take a moment to discuss the way we interface with the internet and how it could be affecting what we perceive as something worth saying, and not think that the internet is a much more powerful tool than we tend to see it is? The flow of water has now turned into an ocean where everyone's stream is on, in, around, and whatever other preposition you can find that would make this sound any less creepy than it already does. Ideas now just proliferate from the amalgamation, with almost no telling where the ripple started, gathers momentum, and moves more of the group until its motion is great that it creates waves, and eventually waves that have gained so much momentum and lifted greater and greater heights out of the water succumb to its mass and crash. This is even a difficult thing for me to grasp, and I'm the shithead that decided to go down this line of personal questioning, so if you're lost, so am I. That's kind of the point of it, I think. Individual ideas are not only so plentiful, but have so much less impact when the other waves didn't even have to crash on an idea. If the wave is big enough, it can just roll by it, over it, or on top of it, and just engulf it, because the amount of energy to even get that wave to stop would require an equally big wave. And to think this whole reason I even posted this idea was Nicki Minaj in the case of the enlarged, well, you know, balls. This isn't to ridicule now. Stop it.
It's time to stop!
From my point of understanding, Mrs. Minaj has been pushed down into the undercurrent of the ocean, so to speak. And if we are to believe her, and I'm not saying to believe her, just to take her perspective into consideration, instead of writing her off writ large because she either actually was told this and believed it, or thought it would be funny to watch the media explode at the SEO they could get from the keywords Nicki Minaj and enlarged testicles in the same article. This is happening more frequently to many that speak out against the main currents. But it feels, and I stress this, feels, I'm not saying either way, like even those who don't go with the flow, let alone try to go against it, get a wave crashing on them. Obviously, I shouldn't have to point this out, but I must for some Luddite that wants to characterize this entire pseudo-philosophical concept as a defense for Mrs. Minaj. It is merely the catalyst. I hate that use of catalyst, by the way. Catalysts don't precipitate an action. They merely increase the rate. But what am I to do with our scientific linguistic misinformation? Remember, kids, context is key. Put the literary use of catalyst in a scientific situation and look how quickly you're a baboon with no right to participate in civil society. What I'm really trying to get at is that the dominant currents are reducing individual waves on a scale at which humanity hasn't experienced. Now imagine separate oceans forming in the same plane. What happens if those oceans expand? This seems to be a different problem than just diverging rivers in our earlier stages, but I'm unsure if that's the appropriate way to ask the question. Would the larger one just envelop the other? Or maybe they would just merge and become one larger ocean. Both of these options can be seen pessimistically or optimistically. In the former case, an engulfing of the other ocean, optimistically, you could hope that you're part of the bigger ocean, and pessimistically, you can see your culture, i.e. your ocean, dry up. In the latter, the merging of the oceans is either further removing the ability of individual movements and exponentially heightening all of the crashes, or uniting consciousness into one, completely dissolving individuality. You can decide for yourself which is pessimistic or optimistic for that one. My point, yes, please get to a point. My point is there is an increase of ideas being labeled as bad or incorrect. Many rightly so, but also sometimes our judgment becomes clouded for one reason or another. Let that be the information one ingests, the information one hasn't ingested, or simply the emotion one feels, like that feeling I referenced earlier. I think this is my contrarian coming out, but because I've been on the losing end of many squabbles, whether that be mental, emotional, physical, legal, or interpersonal, I've tried to come to an understanding that good and bad ideas must exist for there to be ideas at all. Ideas should be able to stand on their own ground, and good ideas stand up to more scrutiny. But removing the ideas so that scrutiny cannot be applied to them makes practicing scrutiny less and less frequent, and less frequent scrutiny allows ideas without a real basis to reach much greater heights without even much effort. If a lake is still, a small rock can make a big splash. And if there is less scrutiny, how are we to determine for ourselves if the waves created are waves moving in the right direction, if every direction we look is the same? Okay, sorry that got a little bit bleak there at the end, but let me tie this up with a little bow here to keep us on the sanity boat. Our evolution is beautiful. I can almost visualize the timeline of our existence, but obviously have to admit, what I don't know still terrifies me. And that's beautiful too, because humanity has been one long, terrifying existence since one could even perceive the concept of fear. The environment around us is constantly changing, whether that be good or bad. We might not even be able to know or even make a choice to slow the tide of the global climate timeline. No, this is not a rebuke on climate change, because obviously, look at that shit out there. It's getting weird as fuck, let's be honest. The point of this whole hullabaloo about creeks and rivers and oceans is that there is a physical flow to our world and a conscious flow of our collective minds. They seem to be crossed at the moment, intersecting, and we must understand the flows, waves, or vibes, for you Zoomers, of the physical world are something that must be respected because ultimately ideas can and do shape our world. But when the world doesn't want to take that shape, there isn't much humanity can do short of destroying it. Which would probably eliminate humans from the character selection pool. Probably. Except for those crafty billionaires and their space ventures, and pay to win always ruins the game, god damn it. I sure hope they don't get too big of a head and think they're better without us. Oh, forgot. No downer ending. Our existence is beautiful, the good and the evil, the right and the wrong. Without one, we would not have the other. P.S. Maybe universal consciousness won't be that bad, but I'll be damned if I'm not gonna preemptively talk shit because my individuality, my privacy, my liberty, my freedom. Honestly, great reasons to resist, in my bumbling idiot's opinion, but still, learning to embrace the unknown and not tangle with it might settle these tides we've been experiencing, Sailor.